Now that we've discussed inertia, and that it can apply not just to massive unintelligent objects, but also to massive unintelligent organizations, let's discuss the inertia of the US federal government. This will be important for the next step of deducing what will be the nudge that will disrupt the status quo and what it will mean for gold and the Federal Reserve Note. But what is this status quo? Those who are in power would like to stay in power, of course, and the main way that they exercise their power is in the spending of money on various projects. As long as the money is available to continue spending as before, and as long as those who provide the money to spend don't feel so discontent that they change the way that they vote, the powers that be will remain content. As a funny side note, I'd like to comment on one of my favorite quotes about taxation here. In 1766, French economist Robert Turgot sent a letter to Scottish philosopher David Hume. In it he said, and I'll summarize in English, that you know as well as I do what is the great aim of all governments on earth: obedience and money. The object is, as the saying goes, to pluck the hen without making it cry out. Hopefully that little quote made you smile. Anyway, back to spending and taxes. What I am showing here is a plot of three things over the past 7 decades. Net outlays, which is another term for spending, current receipts, which is another term for taxes and fees, and gross domestic product. Net outlays and current receipts are plotted on the axis on the left, gross domestic product is plotted on the axis to the right, and the axes are in billions of dollars. Notice all three have risen together. If I had just plotted government spending and taxes, a person would rightly cry out at the giant exponential increase over time. But when comparing against gross domestic product, which has also greatly risen, one can see that taxes and spending have risen alongside of economic activity. So to generate more insight, let's plot the spending of our overlords, elected officials. Let's just call them DC bureaucrats. Let's plot the spending of the DC bureaucrats as a percentage of gross domestic product. There it is. This is a more insightful way of showing the data. This is how much the DC bureaucrats spend as a percentage of all of the economic activity of all the participants in the US economy. Notice that in the 1950s and 1960s, DC bureaucrat spending was about 17% or so of GDP. So for every $6 of economic activity, the bureaucrats spent about $1. The alarming thing is that the percentage has been increasing over time. From about 1980 onward, the average has been closer to 20%. In other words, 1 out of every $5 of economic activity was spent by the bureaucrats. Now, I'm really glad that the swift spike to 30% in 2020 didn't persist. But still, our recent bureaucrat spending has been continuing to trend upward. Maybe they haven't heard enough crying from the hens that they are plucking yet. Now, speaking of plucking, let's plot now how DC bureaucrat spending has compared against tax revenue. Here we see a similar trend. It's upward. Up until about 1980, bureaucrat spending was right around the level of taxes and fees. But after 1980, the spending remained more or less consistently above 100%. In other words, more was being spent than was being collected in taxes and fees. We'll see in a moment why this didn't cause the hens that were being plucked to cry out. Just eyeballing the data, one can see that from 1980 to about 2008, the spending was between about 100% of taxes collected and 120%. Lately, however, the deficits have been much larger. Our bureaucrats have spent up to 150% of collected taxes, and sometimes more. We're getting pretty close to being able to deduce where the nudge is going to come from that's going to change all of this bureaucratic spending inertia, but we need to dig a little deeper. Let's take a more detailed look at the taxes and fees side of things to see who has been paying for the lion's share of the spending. After all, if Atlas is going to shrug or if the hen is going to start crying out, we need to figure out where Atlas or whether hen is. I found some data to show the various percent contributions of different sources of taxes and fees. You can see here that I've plotted them. We have the individual income tax on the bottom, followed by social insurance tax, which is primarily Social Security and Medicare, followed by corporate taxes, then excise taxes, and then a small account called Other, which we don't need to delve into because it's pretty small. Excise taxes are basically taxes on alcohol, tobacco, ozone-depleting chemicals, medical devices, telecommunication fees, and other nuisance fees that we tend to pay but usually don't give much thought to. I'd like to point your attention to something on here that's pretty glaring. You might not easily spot it, and I'm sure our bureaucrats would prefer it that way because they use clever accounting to disguise it. But let's talk about it. Notice that individuals used to pay 50% of the tax burden, and now they pay more than 75% of it. Wait, you might say. Your graph is showing in blue that individuals have generally paid less than 50% of all tax revenue. Aha! And that's where the clever accounting comes in. Remember, Social Security taxes are 12.4% of money earned, and Medicare adds 1.45%. And if you're a W-2 employee, you pay half of the Social Security tax and your employer pays the other half. But if you're self-employed or a 1099 contractor, you pay the full 12.4% of Social Security and the full amount of Medicare. Now, I suspect many people are self-employed or 1099 contractors, so the total burden of social insurance tax, shown here in red, is placed more on the individual than on the corporations. So between individual income tax and social insurance tax, I'd guess that the percentage of total government revenue from individuals has risen from 50% to at least 70%, if not 75%. And that's not all. Notice that the revenue generated from taxes on corporations has fallen from about 25% in 1950 to well under that now. Is it any wonder that we've seen a bull market in stocks? When we include social insurance tax in the mix of all bureaucrat revenue sources, we can see that the tax burden has greatly shifted away from corporations and towards the individual. And this is an accounting illusion, one that the DC bureaucrats greatly need to maintain. We've heard lots of grumbling lately in DC about Social Security and the needs to shore it up, haven't we? Now, speaking of illusions, we haven't fully grasped the full nature of the problem. Remember that I showed you a plot of government spending as a function of its revenue? Remember how recently the spending has been greater than the taxes and fees? In our current plot, we're only showing the various contributions to tax receipts. We need to go one step further and show the various contributors to spending. And let's do that now. Now our picture is a little bit more complete. I added deficit spending. This represents the amount that the bureaucrats have spent that's over and above what's been collected in taxes and fees. And this category represents an expansion in debt. After all, the only way to pay for current spending, if it's not covered by taxes and fees, is by borrowing. So the deficit spending category is nothing more than debt-based financing. One can clearly see the trend that started in earnest in 1970. A greater and greater portion of bureaucrat spending has been in the form of borrowing from the future. And this picture alone is enough to give even the healthiest among us a heart attack. But I'm about to say something that's a little bit more shocking. Are you sitting down? Well, make sure you are. I don't want to be responsible for fainting-related injuries. There's an additional accounting illusion that we need to discuss here. Up until recently, the Social Security system has been what's called in a surplus. In other words, in this red category, more revenue has been collected from taxpayers than was paid out to recipients. And that surplus went to be spent on other things. The surplus was replaced with a bunch of IOUs, which are not considered part of the public debt, but which are very much debt-based promises. So the actual level of deficit-based spending is much larger than what's being shown here. It extends well into the red region, and it's just massive. Now, notice that for the past 20 years or so, the contribution of social insurance tax in support of bureaucrat spending has been gradually declining. And this is because more and more people are starting to retire and claim Social Security benefits in proportion to the number of people that are paying in. So the so-called Social Security Trust Fund, or those IOUs that I was telling you about, that are not included in the public debt figures, has been expanding at a slower and slower pace. The Social Security surpluses have been shrinking, and it's forced our bureaucrats to borrow in a more public way to continue to spend. But the accounting illusion is starting to no longer work, and our bureaucrats are starting to work on ways to weave a new illusion. Now, we can start making some inferences about what the future might hold, and I'll be talking about those in my next video. In the meantime, I'm interested to hear your thoughts, so please feel free to comment, and don't forget to click the like button if you'd like for YouTube to show this video to others. See you later, fellow hens. Don't forget to cry out a little as you're being plucked.